Right then, so let's head back to the layout view. So we've got a bit more of area to work with. And I'll just bring the robot a bit closer so I can show you the problem that we've got. We'll turn on Cycles Render View. We'll turn off overlays. And the first problem obviously is, in the viewport, we need to be able to see the PNG sequence rather than the HDRI. So let's bring up the shader editor. And make sure the shader editor is in world mode because we're going to change the actual background, not the materials on the object. And then in the shader editor, we're going to add Shift-A, S, Image Texture. And we're going to bring in the PNG sequence. So open this up, navigate to the sequence, make sure it's in order, A to select all, and then import. We're going to plug this into the background color. Now straight away it's just going to be grey, and that's because we need to give it some coordinates to use. So Control T with this selected, and this will add these for us using the node wrangler. And we need to change this from UVs, because it's the world environment, to the window, so it covers the entire window. And there we go. We also need to disable repeating because we don't want it going all the way around outside of the camera's bounds. So in here, in the image node, we'll turn on clip instead of repeat. And also, but very importantly, make sure we turn on auto refresh so that when we change frames, the background will update accordingly. Alright. We can see that the robot is now not lit very well at all, and that's just because the PNG image sequence can't provide the same sort of lighting that the HDR image can. So what we need to do is say, use the HDRI for everything except the camera background. And in order to do that, we'll put down a mix node, so Shift-A, S, mix node, and make sure you change this to color rather than float. I'll just zoom in a bit. Color. We'll drop this in here, and then we're going to put the PNG sequence into the B socket, so the bottom socket. And we'll put the HDRI into the top A socket. So this means the factor means if the factor is 0, it's going to use the top one, which is the HDRI, and if it's 1, or true, in other words, then it's going to use the bottom one. So we need to say, if it's a camera ray, use the bottom one, but for everything else, reflections and lighting, use the top one. So Shift-A, S, light path node, drop this in, just bring it down a bit so we can see. And we've got the ability to say which sort of ray is it. So if it's a camera ray, this will output true. So if we plug this into the factor, anything that's a camera ray now is going to get the bottom socket because that is equal to true or 1. And now you can see we're getting the robot lit by the HDRI, but we're getting the PNG sequence showing in the camera's background. Okay, so with that done, we'll go full screen and we'll have a look at the issue we've got. You can see at the moment the robot isn't casting any shadows on the floor. We're not getting the correct reflections. If we look at this shoe here, just Control B, I can draw a render region so it renders more quickly. We're getting a green reflection rather than the blue reflection of this pavement. And we can see this down here as well. And if we go to other areas, so Control Alt B to undo the render region. Let's go to this shoulder and come forward a few frames. So if we look here on the shoulder, you can see we're actually getting the HDRI image. Well, it's difficult to tell, but we've got a green field with trees there, not the fence and everything that we can see in the actual background here. It's not reflecting the houses and this tree and this hedge. Also, we're getting the incorrect lighting. So in this area, the white would be getting bounced light off this blue floor, and it would be sort of making a bit of a blue tinge on the robot. So that's incorrect as well. So there's a few things we need to fix. So let's turn back on the pavement, and this should give us shadows. Let's just have a look. So we've got shadows on the pavement now, on this area, but obviously the pavement is the wrong colour. Now we could just turn on the shadow catcher in the object properties, and then under visibility, we can turn on shadow catcher, making sure we select the pavement first. Shadow catcher, it disappears, but if we look at the shoe, obviously we're getting the white material still showing up in the reflections, not the pavement. So what we'll need to do, let's just turn off shadow catch just temporarily. We'll go into the shader editor and we'll apply new material to this pavement. And we want to project the PNG sequence onto the pavement as well as the HDRI background. So just going back into the World tab, I'm just going to copy these three nodes. So the PNG sequence, text coordinate and mapping. Control C, back to the object, mode, and then Control V, and we'll just plug this into the base color. And because of course we're still using window, this will be correct and it will match up perfectly with the background. As we can see just here, we've got the leaves and everything correctly placed. So if I just turn off the pavement completely, you'll see it's identical. Now obviously the pavement is too bright, and there's a number of reasons for this. The first one, we need to turn off specular so we're not getting any reflections on the pavement. Just to remind you, in Blender 4, that's under the specular drop down and it's now called IOR level. We also need to turn roughness all the way down. That'll make it a bit more dark, or we can turn it right up, whichever you prefer. Maybe turn it right up, it'll make it a bit brighter, but we can fix that if we go into between the PNG sequence and the base color. What we need to do is basically make this darker, and the reason it's brighter is because in the video footage it was being lit by the actual sky, but now we're also relighting it with the HDRI background. So to counteract this, we just need to reduce the brightness. So Shift A, S, an RGB curves node. And the first thing we want to do is take a bit of this blue tinge out. So we'll go to the blue mode of the RGB curves node and just bring this down a little bit. Maybe about here. And then we'll also reduce the brightness by going to the color mode of the RGB curves node and then bring this down, and this will reduce RG and B. We'll bring that down until the difference is imperceivable. And now if we zoom in on these areas, you'll see that we're getting the reflection of the pavement in the metal shoes. We're also getting bounce lighting coming off of the pavement, so we're getting a bit of a sort of a darker blue tinge on the robot itself. So the reflections and the indirect lighting are working, but the problem is, if we look at the rest of the robot over here, we're still getting the reflection from the HDRI environment. We're still not getting the reflection from behind the robot. So what we're going to need to do is make a very crude model of the background, which will block out the HDRI world environment so that the PNG sequence is actually reflected into the other parts of the robot as well. Okay, so we'll come back into this mode and we'll make sure we've got the pavement selected, turn on overlay so I can see it, into edit mode. Number 2 for edge mode, alt click this side edge, and let's go to frame 1 so we can see a little bit better. I'm going to extrude this upwards on the z-axis to about the height of the flowers and the grass. GX to move it across a little bit. I'll just turn off proportional editing. Let's go full screen. And now I'm going to do EX to extrude on the x-axis to around about this area over here. And then for this edge, I'll do the same E, and then X to extrude it just to about the bottom of the fence in this area down in the right hand side. Okay, so let's come out of camera mode. I want to extrude a boundary wall all the way around so that boundary blocks out the HDRI, making it reflect in the robot instead of that HDRI image. So select everything, A, and we'll go to select, loops, boundary loop, and then we'll just do E and Z to extrude that up, creating a perimeter wall for us to project that PNG sequence onto. Let's go into camera view. We need to make sure that the wall is completely blocking the background all the way through. For example, here we can see down the side of the wall. We can see the background. So in that case, what we need to do is just, let's come out of it, come into this mode. We'll select this side wall just from the end over there to this one. And then we go back into camera view, and we just need to make sure that we move that so that we can, it's blocking the background completely. So let's just play this back. We'll make sure that it's always completely, there we go. So here, it's not high enough. So I'm just going to, with it still selected, press G and then Z. And we'll just move this up on the global Z axis till it's back outside of the camera at the top there. And I'll just play all the way through and look for any of the areas. So there as well. GZ, bring it up again. Yeah, that's fine. So if we now come back out of edit mode into object mode, we'll turn cycles view back on. And I'll just come a little bit closer with the robot. So I'll bring up a timeline and just scrub a little bit closer so the robot's nearer to us. Press home so we can see the entire camera. And if we turn back on the shadow catcher for the pavement so we can't see the actual geometry. And then zoom in on a part of the robot. We'll see we're actually reflecting now the PNG sequence instead of that HDRI background because the geometry that we've just built is occluding the background environment. Now there's a few problems with this. And to make it a little bit more easy to see, I'll quickly add a shiny chrome sphere. And the problem is, we're reflecting correctly whatever's in the viewport, so whatever's visible in the camera background, but beyond that, we're just getting black because the texture that is being projected onto this pavement object that we've created is only being projected within the window, not beyond the window. So what we need to do is get the PNG sequence to stay planted to the areas that are outside of the camera's view so that they still appear in the reflections. And there's a couple of ways we can do it. We can do it entirely in the shader, or we can paint it manually using texture painting. I'll show you both methods because they'll be useful in future regardless. But to get a good result, regardless of which method you choose, you need to make a few modifications to the geometry itself. So let's just go out of camera mode. We'll go into edit mode. What we need to do is subdivide this object so that we've got more resolution on the mesh. If you try and project or paint onto a mesh that is quite sparse regarding geometry, then the result will be quite wavy and distorted. So I'm just going to add some loop cuts to this. So I'll hover my mouse over one of the edges. I'll press Ctrl R and hover it over this edge to start with, and then scroll the mouse wheel upwards until we've got a few more divisions. Try and get it so that each face is square. And we'll do the same on this side, Ctrl R, about here, and over on this pavement as well. So put one, I think we'll put one here. We'll put one here as well. And it's still not enough, so I'm going to now select everything, right click, and then subdivide. If we just come into camera view and have a look at the resolution we've got, probably subdivide one more time, right click, subdivide again. So now we should have enough resolution in order to not get a wavy result on the projected texture. And it's probably worth getting rid of this harsh edge here and here as well. So number 2, to enter edge mode, I'm going to alt click on this one and alt shift click on this one. So I've selected both of these. I'll just do Control B. We'll add a little bit of a curved corner. So Control B and then use the mouse wheel to add a few subdivisions. Just be careful you don't overlap any surrounding geometry. So that should be enough. The next thing we need to do is add UV coordinates to the entire mesh. So if we go into the UV editing workspace, so General, UV editing, you'll see we've got the UVs over here. Let's just select number 3. If I select, say, these faces here, you can see that we don't yet have any UVs for the object. So we need to create those in order for us to get the texture to be projected onto the object correctly. So we'll select everything, A, we'll press U, and I'll just do a Smart UV project. And then we're going to say, give it an island margin so we don't get any bleeding while we're painting between the islands. So I'll maybe go with 0.01. And I'll say OK to this. And now we've got some usable UVs that we can paint the texture onto. Now it's important when you unwrap that your geometry covers as much of the UV tile as possible. Otherwise you're just going to be wasting all of these pixels in the image when you paint on. You're only going to be painting into this small area. So if you should have seen the UV chapter earlier, which will explain how to do manual UV unwrapping. So if you haven't seen that and you don't know how to do it, make sure you go back and watch that first. But in a nutshell, we can try doing it again. So we've got U, Smart UV Project, but this time choose Scale to Bound. This will stretch it out, but we're still not getting there's quite a bit of space still being unutilized. So I'll just do a quick manual unwrap by creating seams myself. So in edge mode, I'll choose an edge that's on a right angle. I'll press Shift G and I'll say choose all edges with a similar angle of surrounding faces. So now we've chosen all the edges that have similar angles. And I'll right click and I'll say Mark Seam. So choose all the faces, unwrap, and now we're going to get a bit of a different result, but we've still got a lot of space not filled. And that's just because this time I've modelled it much longer than I needed to. So you can see we've got long areas that can't really be broken down and fit into this UV tile. So all I'll do in this scenario is just mark a few more UV seams so it can be broken down smaller. Something like that. Mark those as seams as well. And then we'll select everything again and then we'll do another unwrap. And it should fill more of that space now. And it doesn't matter about them being perfect because we're only going to use these to paint a texture onto the geometry that is never going to be seen directly. It's only going to affect reflections and indirect lighting. So you don't need to be too much of a perfectionist about it. Just make sure you're using as much of the UV tile as you can. So we'll tackle the texture painting method first. So if we go over to the UV section in the Data tab, you can see we've already created one UV map. This is the one that we're going to be painting onto, but we also need a second set of UVs that we can project from. So if we go into camera view, we need to project from the camera view because the 2D coordinates that we're going to be projecting from need to match up with how the geometry actually looks in the 3D viewport in order for this to work properly. So we'll create a new one by clicking the plus icon, and we'll call this one Project. And with all the faces selected on the geometry, we'll press U, and then we'll say Project from View. And now you'll see we've got a representation in 2D space, which pretty much matches up with the way we can see it in the camera. Before we start painting, we need something to paint onto. So we're going to paint onto a texture, obviously. So let's go back to the layout where we've got the texture editor. And I want to create in the shader for the pavement. So I'm just going to call this, let's call it Crude Environment Model. And Shift A, S, we're going to put down a new image texture. And we're going to choose New. And we'll call this Projected Texture. Doesn't need to be massive because, as I mentioned earlier, we're never actually going to see the texture. It's only going to be reflections and indirect lighting. So 4096 should be sufficient. Very importantly, make sure you've got alpha ticked, and we need to change the colour so that the alpha is set to 0. And then choose OK. And with this selected, we'll go back into, in fact, we'll create a new workspace. And this one's going to be texture painting. We're going to camera view, and we need to choose the clone brush. Into the options for the clone brush, under the tool section on the right hand side, we've got the texture slots panel. In Blender 4, these options are no longer located here. Instead, just at the top there, just click this drop down, and then you've got the options in here. So we want to paint onto a texture, so a single image. And the texture I want to paint onto is the one I've just created called Projected Texture. And the UVs that I want to use to paint onto is the UV map, the original one. This is where I want the painted pixels to go. So onto this map we've got here. And if we come down to the bottom, we've got the Clone from Paint slot option. Tick this one. And then in here, we've got the option to choose a clone source. So the clone source I want to choose is going to be Nightmare 134, so that's the image sequence. But before you select it, go over here to the textures, and we're going to add a new one, and we'll just open the image sequence again, make sure they're in order, open image, and then turn on auto refresh. And just double check that the frames start and offset have been automatically populated. Otherwise, the texture that you're cloning from is going to be the incorrect frame. Now, the reason we have to do this is because this one will update when we change the frame in the texture painting editor, whereas the material one doesn't for some reason. I'm not sure why. With this done, we can now go in here. We'll still only have the one instance of Nightmare 134, but it should now work because we've got it in here as well. And then last thing, we need to set the UV coordinates that we're going to project from. And this is going to be the project ones we created. Make sure you're still in the same frame that you're on when you did the UV project. And now we can start painting. So I'll just hide the tool panel. And then if we start painting, you'll see it starts to get darker as I paint on this. And this is because we're starting to see the texture on the geometry instead of the world environment. And the reason we're seeing the world environment before we paint is because the image that we're painting onto is pure alpha. So it's basically see-through at the moment. Speaking of which, make sure that the brush strength is set to 1. Otherwise, the resulting image will still be a little bit transparent, and therefore the object using that image will also be a bit transparent, which of course you don't want. So we'll continue painting until we've painted all of this geometry, and you'll see as I paint over here, we're starting to see that appear on the image over here as well. Now, to make it a bit quicker, we can bring up the M panel. We'll go down to the options section, and then under the screen, the external section, we'll click on Applied Camera Image, and then we'll choose Nightmare 134, and it will automatically project it on and paint for us. Now, it doesn't seem to do it everywhere. I'm not sure why, but what we can do is just come out and then start painting on here, and we can press F to resize the brush, and then we can paint the bits that weren't automatically painted on for us. And if you find it's a little bit slow with regarding performance, it's just because the mesh is quite dense because we've subdivided it. So you can press F and then resize your brush downwards, and then you should get faster performance. And there we go. So once you've done the first one, we can then move on to a different camera angle. So we go back into camera view, we'll press play until we start to see parts that are not yet painted on. So for example, if I go to frame 1, we've got all this area that we've not painted. We'll go back into edit mode, make sure everything's selected, back into the data panel, choose the project map, and we'll reproject again, project from view. Very importantly, reselect the UV map before you go back into texture paint, and then you can start painting on. Now you'll notice here, it's not actually working correctly. And that's just because, if I just undo that, it's not updated over here, the texture. So just to get it to update, go back into the texture panel, and you'll see that quickly updated, and now I can start painting. And in some areas, you might find, for example here, you're not getting a perfect lineup of the two different maps that you've painted. And that's just because when we painted the previous frame, that part of the screen that we're getting the distortion would have been right at the very side of the screen where the camera's got more distortion. But now that area is more central horizontally, painting over it should give us a better result without the distortion. Or alternatively, instead of cloning from the distorted image sequence that we've got over here, when we did the motion track earlier, you remember the camera settings has got these lens distortion parameters that we've either entered ourselves based on the camera or that have been found for us by the radial distortion refine option here. So when motion tracking found these and we set up the scene at the bottom there, when we choose to set up the tracking scene, it's also created some nodes for us in the compositing workspace so that we can undistort the footage based on those distortion values. So if I just mute this undistortion node, you'll see the image changes, and this is the distorted version. And then if I turn this back on, this is the undistorted version. So if we want to output this as a PNG image sequence, all we'd need to do is, we don't really need these ones. We could just get rid of these and plug this into the composite and into the viewer. And now we can set in the output properties, a new PNG image sequence like we did earlier when we had originally created the PNG sequence. Save it somewhere and then Control F12 and it will output this entire movie clip for us, but undistorted. And then you can bring that in, that new undistorted sequence into the texture area instead of this one. And then you can paint the undistorted version in the texture painting workspace, and you won't get distortion near the edges between different frames. But in this case, I'm not too bothered about going to all that effort because this is never going to be visible to the camera, only in reflections and indirect lighting. So I'll just finish up painting this frame. Alright, so we've got all those on. We'll continue playing back now until we find areas we've not done. So all this area here on the fence we've not done yet. So again, into edit mode, we'll select the data panel, choose the project UVs, view, project from view, reselect the UV map, back into texture paint mode, and then we can continue painting the bits we've not yet done. Again, it's not updated the image, so I'll undo that. Choose the image tab, the texture tab, it's updated, and now I can start painting. And then I'll just keep repeating this process until I've got all of the model painted. And if you can, try and make sure that the back face has got as little of the hedge on as possible so that we're getting a much better result. Again, same for the pavement as well. And I'll just speed this section up now while I quickly paint the rest of it. I don't want to bore you to death. Alright, so we've got all the bits painted that were in camera. What we now need to do is paint the bits that weren't in camera. Now obviously we're going to have to make this up. And the way we'll do it is by cloning from parts of the image that we've already created. So we'll press the N key to bring up the tool panel again, and we'll just turn off the clone from paint slot now. With that turned off, we can now place the 3D cursor at the point we want to clone from. So I'm going to control click here, and if it's a little bit shiny in your viewport, then go to the render options here and just turn off specular at the bottom. So with the cursor placed there, so control left click to place it wherever you want to copy from, and then we can start painting over what we've already got. So I'll control click this area, and then I'll start painting across here. There you see we've got to the end wall. And then I'll replace it here, and we'll continue painting across again. And I'm generally just making this up now. I'm just making the brush a bit smaller, and then every time you let go of the mouse button, it'll restart cloning from where the from where the 3D cursor is. And for this back wall, I'm just going to copy from over here, and we can do that in the UV editor. So let's go back to the UV editor workspace. And in this one, I'll go into edit mode. Make sure we turn on overlays. I just want to select all this back wall, so make sure I'm in face mode. I'll choose the top one, and then I'll control shift click down here, and this will select all of the faces diagonally and expand them outward. If we go to the UV editor here, we can see we've got these selected, and we can move these now. Let's just see what happens over here as well. Just turn off the overlays while we do this. I can move these now, and we'll see it come into place over here. If it's the wrong way around, just rotate it in the UV editor, and you can scale it down as well until we've got that there. And just be careful, you want to make sure you've got no areas that are transparent. So I'll now continue back into texture paint mode. I'll click here, make sure we're in the clone tool, control click to place the 3D cursor. We'll turn back on the toggle overlays, and now we can start painting the bits in that are transparent. Right, so we've got all that painted on. Oh, there's a little bit here as well we could do with the fence. So I'll turn back on the overlays, go into edit mode. I'll select this part of the geometry, so make sure I've still got face mode selected. I'll choose that one, control shift click here, then we'll go back into the UV editor over here, find those UVs, and then I'll just move these until they're on this fence. and then scale as appropriately. Rotate around. And we can even scale -1, so S, Y, -1. And that's flip the UVs on the y-axis, so this axis here. And now we've got it a little bit better lined up. So I'll just quickly tidy up any other dodgy bits. And you'll notice that the texture is quite stretched here. Now it's going to look fine in the camera view, so if I go back to that frame, you can see it all looks correct. But it might reflect a little bit strangely in the robot, but the robot reflection areas are so small, I'm not going to bother with it here, but just in case you run into it and it does cause problems, what you can do is clone from another area to get more, less stretching in those areas. But I'm not going to bother here. I'm quite happy with the result I've got. All right. So let's go back over here and have a quick look at what we've got. You notice we've got a few areas that are a little bit transparent still. This is probably due to the fall off of the brush where we've not fully painted an area. To fix it, we can go into the paint tool this time and we'll turn on add alpha, and then we can paint the alpha back in. Be careful not to add alpha back to the parts in between though. And now what we can do is get rid of any of these parts that we don't want at the top. So we'll go into the paintbrush tool again, if we're not already in it, and we'll change it from add alpha to erase alpha, and now we can just start deleting the parts which are outside of the bounds of the camera. Just the parts that we don't want. And if we turn the fall off down a little bit, then we'll get a smoother transition between the object that we've got and the HDRI background. So we don't get sort of sharp edges in the reflections. So I'll do that. Just delete the bits across. You can't see the soft transition, unfortunately, in this viewport, but we can see it over here in the 2D editor. So as I've just deleted those branches, you'll see we're getting a soft fall off there. But we can also do it in this view as well. So we'll just do it in here. Get a nice gradual transition. You've just got to be careful you don't accidentally delete the parts of the image which are at the bottom of the geometry. Back into camera view. Let's have a look in rendered view. So actually go back to layout mode now. And very importantly, don't forget, you must save your image separately to the blend file. If you save the blend file, close it down and reopen it without saving here, you're going to lose all that work you've done. So always make sure you save it. And when you save it, image, save as, make sure you've got RGBA enabled. Otherwise, you're not going to get the alpha channel. Save that. We'll go back to the layout view now and we'll see what the result's like. You'll notice we're still getting the same result as before. We're still getting the black reflections, and that's because we've not yet assigned this to the base colour. So if we plug this into the base colour, this is the texture we've just painted. You can see now we're getting the actual painted reflections instead. We've still got the black areas, and this is because we need to tell Blender to make the black areas, the alpha areas, transparent. So we'll take the alpha output and we'll plug it into a mix shader this time. And we'll make sure this goes into the bottom. So where the alpha is white, in other words, the bits we have painted, it's going to get the bottom socket. And where the alpha is not white, so the black areas, it's going to get the top one. So for the top one, we'll use a transparent BSDF. We'll plug that into the top. We'll plug the alpha into the factor. And now we're getting a see-through here, and we're getting that gradual transition at the top of the painted area so that it's not so obvious in the reflection when we're at a reasonable distance away. Now what I also want to happen is, I want to take advantage of the moving PNG sequence when we can. So inside of the camera's view, I want it to use this texture, the moving one, and not this one. And in order to do that, we'll do Shift-A, S, mix this time, make sure it's set to colour, And we'll plug this into the bottom. And then for this one, we'll use the alpha of the PNG sequence here so that it uses the bottom socket when this is white, and then it uses this one, so the colour from this one, outside of the camera's view. And then we'll plug this into the base colour instead. Now the parts of the geometry that are in view are going to be getting that moving PNG sequence, and the bits outside of the camera's view are going to be getting the PNG sequence that we painted. This would just mean we get moving reflections, for example, where the cars are going past, or where the branches are in view that are moving around. So that's the first way we can do it. The second way we can do it involves just doing it in here, so there's not as much manual labour. So let's duplicate the crude environment and shader that we've got. I'll call this crude phi2 and just delete everything we don't need anymore. Control X, Control X. Put the viewport into solid mode. We'll hide the pavement in the viewport. We want to find a frame. I'm going to start where we've got most of that back wall not covered by the tree and it's not too blurry. So probably around about here. And if we just unhide the pavement, that should be good. And we'll just toggle the X-ray on. So we've only got a little bit of that tree covering that back wall. And I'll look over here which frame I'm on. So I'm on frame 208. So I'm going to do Shift A, S, Image Texture, and I'm going to bring in frame 208. So open from the sequence, frame 208. Open that up. And I need to create a new set of UVs now so that this is permanently planted in place based on the current frame. So go into the data panel, making sure you've got the pavement selected. Go into edit mode, A to select everything, and we'll add a new UV map. So click the plus icon, and I'm going to call this frame 208. And I'll do U, project from view, so it's created a new UV map for this frame based on the current view. I'm going to do Shift A, S, UV, and I'll specify that 208 UVs to use for the image 208. I'll plug that in there. Now plug this into, we'll just put it directly into the material surface input. We'll go into EV mode, aka material preview mode. We'll come out of camera view. Come out of edit mode. And we'll just turn off on the image, repeat, so we'll turn this to clip. Now you can see that has been permanently projected onto that part of the model that was visible without us needing to paint at all. Now what we need to do is get the other frames in the other black areas, in the areas that are currently black. And it's really simple to do. All we'll do, we'll duplicate this, so Shift D. I'll make sure I tick this little number 2 so when I modify this, it doesn't modify the one above. And we'll go to a different frame now. So I'll turn back off the pavement. In fact, let's leave it turned on. We'll play forward until we've got a black area in view. Probably around about this sort of area. Don't go too close to the edges just so we can minimise stretching from the camera distortion. And I want to mix these two together now so that the bottom one goes in the black areas. And the black areas, of course, if we look at the alpha on here, the white areas from the first one are when this image is in use, and the black areas on the alpha are when we want to use this one. So same as before, put that back in, we'll do Shift A, S, we're going to do a mix node, and we're going to change this to colour, plug it in there, and I want to say when it's white, the alpha here, use the bottom socket. Plug that in there. And whatever is in the top is going to be where the alpha is black. So we want to use the new image down here. We need to load in the correct image, which we've not done yet. So we're going to look at up here, we're on frame 366. So even though we're on 233, we're using image 366. So I'll create a new UV map. I'll call this 366. I'll select 366 here, and I'll open frame 366 here. And then we're going to edit mode, making sure we've got 366 UV map selected, U, reject from view, back out of edit mode, and you'll see we've now got, if we come out, this area projected on as well. So we'll just repeat that. We'll go back in here, we'll play it back until we've got more black area in view. So probably go to the end frame, and this is going to be frame 411, so the last frame of the image sequence. We'll copy this again, Shift D, we'll create a new UV map for 411, change it here to 411, we'll go into edit mode, make sure everything's selected, project from view, and then we're going to mix this one in now, and we'll just duplicate this one, Shift D, bring this over here, we'll plug that into the bottom, we'll take the alpha from this one into the top, and then we'll plug this one into the top here to replace that, and make sure we change this to use frame 411. And there we go. Now the advantage of this system is we can actually modify, rather than getting a difference in exposure, we can put down Shift 8S, RGB curve node in here, and then we can just modify this by bringing up the mid-range a bit until it seems to fit more seamlessly. And if we come out now, you see we've got more of an area. Now the problem is, because I've used this alpha, it's actually made all this section black, where this has got no data. So what we need to do is add these two alphas together. So Shift A, S, mix, and we'll go with color. We'll plug this in here, but we're going to change it from mix to add. We're basically going to add these two alphas together. Got it on the wrong one. Alt, click, drag, and we'll drag it over the alpha. And then we'll plug this alpha in here. It's going to add those together, and now we're keeping the original ones over here as well. Now the only issue here is we can't paint, or we can sort of we can bake in, and then we can clone across and do the same technique with the UV as we did before. So we'll get to that in a second. I'm going to go back to frame 1, into camera view, where we've got some of this black area, and I'm going to basically do the same thing again. So copy this, Shift D, bring it down. I'll check which frame we're on at the top image sequence, so 134, and I'll create a new UV map for frame 134. Change that here. Go into edit mode, view, reject from view. We'll choose image 134. We'll duplicate this mix node, Shift D. This one's going to be going into the bottom. We'll copy this add node, so Shift D. And now we need to add this alpha to the alpha that we've just done. And then this one. And then we're going to take the bottom one here. So this bottom one we've just made, 134, into the top. So this will now be used outside of any black areas of these alphas that are added together. So plug this one into the factor. So this is all of the alphas so far added together. If we come out now, we're now getting that area in view. So let's have a look. And we're basically back where we were when we did the painting previously, with the benefit of we've not had to do any work really. And we've got a bit of a better transition here because we were able to adjust the actual colour of the image that was being projected. Well, one thing I've just noticed actually, if we come across here, you can see we're getting a bit of a weird half transparent look where the images have been blended together. So all I've done there is in the add node, if I choose these, H to unhide them, I've set the factor to 0.5 instead of 1. So we're not getting the correct result basically. Let's drag this to 1. We'll drag this one to 1 as well. And now the alphas have been added together correctly and we should get a better result. So what we need to do now is basically what we did before, paint in these parts that we've got outside of the camera's original view. Now, we can't obviously paint onto this because it's not a texture. We're going to have to convert it into a texture first. So we go back into the shader editor and we need to create a new texture now. So Shift A, S, same as before, image texture. We'll create a new one and I'll call this shader projected. Give it a similar resolution, so 4096 by 4096. Make sure we set the color alpha to 0 and alpha's turned on here. Click OK, and then we just need to hook this tree up now so that it goes via the principal BSDF. So I'll disconnect this one, which was Alt right click and drag, and then we'll connect this one to the base color. We'll connect this to the surface input, and we need to add the transparency. Shift A, S, and then transparent, BSDF. Oh, not translucent. Shift A, S, transparent BSDF. Shift A, S, mix shader. We'll plug this one into the bottom, the transparent into the top again, same as before. And then we need to add all of the alphas together now. So we've got one more down in the last one that we made. So Shift D to copy this one. And I'll select this alpha and plug it into the bottom. And then this alpha, so all these three combined, and plug this into the top. Make sure it's set to add and it's on factor of 1. And we'll plug this into the factor of the mix shader so that anything that's not got pixels in it from any of these textures will get transparent instead. Next thing we need to do is select this, and we need to create a new UV map because we've been messing around with the ones we created earlier. These ones here we've pulled all over the place. So we'll click plus, and we'll say new UV, select the pavement, select all the faces, U, and then we'll do a smart UV project again, or whichever type of unwrap you did earlier. And then we'll say OK, so that will have now unwrapped that into the new UV map we've created here. And then making sure this one is selected, we'll go into the render settings so that we can make it render a little bit faster because we don't need particularly high quality for this. So we'll set the noise threshold to 0.1 so it finishes rendering more quickly. Turn off the denoiser, quite importantly, and we'll change max samples to, let's say, 16. And then we'll go all the way down, still inside the render panel, to the bake-in section. And we'll change this from combined to diffuse. And we only want the colour, we don't want any influence from the HDRI. So turn those off. And just double check everything's set up correctly. Yeah, and you need to have this one selected in order for it to work. And then we'll choose bake. And I'll just bring up an image editor so we can see what happened. Make sure we select the one we've just made. So shader projected. It's going to be empty so far because we set it as alpha 0. And I'll come over here and I'll click bake. You've got to make sure you're not in edit mode and you've got to have the pavement selected and this texture node selected as well. Click bake. Should be quite quick with such low render settings. And there we go. So we've got the new texture now created here. So we need to make sure we save it. It's got a little star next to it. So image, save, and I'll call this one shader projected.png, making sure RGBA is turned on, and we'll choose save image. And now we can actually replace all of these. So let's get rid of these. So X to delete those. And we can just plug this in instead over here. And we need to make sure we specify which UV map to use. So Shift A S UV. And this time I'm going to be using new UV. Plug that in there. And there we go. Same as before though, we need to use the alpha to drive the factor for the transparency. Plug that in there. And now when we render, we go into camera view. We should be getting an identical result. Let's just turn off the shadow catcher in the object properties for the pavement. So down to visibility, and we'll turn off shadow catcher, and now we can see it in the viewport. And I'll turn off repeat as well, just one clip. We zoom in, you can see we're getting the alpha taking effect, so we're only getting pixels from the texture where we've got no alpha. If I just disable this, just plug this PSDF in directly, then you'll see we'll be getting that black part. And now the same as before, with the pavement still selected, we'll go to the texture paint mode, making sure we've got the right texture selected, so shader projected this time. And we've got the correct UV selected as well, these ones here. We can do the same that we did before. We can go around with the erase alpha, and we can get rid of the top part. We just need to make sure in here we're looking at the right one. So change this to shader projected as well. And now I'll speed it up because I'm basically going to do exactly the same as I did in the previous video. And if you're getting a weird result like this, we can go into the stroke and just tweak the settings for the spacing, turn it down to 1%. Now it should be a bit smoother. Right, and now we've got a very similar result, but we didn't have to do as much manual work because most of it was done by the nodes for us. I can just see I've accidentally removed this part over here. So that's because basically I've removed over there, so I can't do that. I need to put that back. So add alpha, I'll just add this bit back in. And that will come back in over here as well. And the reason that's happened is because both of those areas of the mesh are sharing the same texture space because I've moved the UVs to match the same area. So I can't erase part of the image below, on one wall without it affecting the other one because they're both basically using the same part of the image. So there we go. That's the second method. Whichever you think is the best to use. I mean, personally, I think this method gives a better result because you've got more control over the exposure of the individual projected images. Whereas if you're painting it on, then you're sort of stuck with it. So this will probably give a little bit of a better result in the render. So if we look at the render now, of course, don't forget to save the image before you do anything else. Otherwise, you risk losing it all. Again, that's just in the image editor at the top, and then save. So go back to the layout now. And we're going to the camera view. Zoom out a bit. And you can see we're getting a similar result as before, but we've just done it in a different way. Right, so all we need to do now is reconnect this image sequence so that this shows in the camera view rather than the painted one we've got here. So we'll just move these up out of the way. And we'll Shift A to add a mix node. Make sure this is set to color, not float. We'll drag it onto this connection here between this one. And then we'll use the alpha here to choose what gets shown. So currently it's showing the bottom socket if it's in view. We don't want that, so we're going to plug this in here. And now we're getting the PNG sequence showing inside the camera view, and this one showing outside of the camera view. Now we need to move this RGB curves node because obviously we want to make sure that both of the one we've painted and the one that's been projected from the sequence is using the same tone mapping, so we'll just bring this across, Alt left click to move it, and then we'll drag it over here. And then for the transparency, where we mix the shader, we want to combine both of the alphas of the one that we've painted and also this one, because this one will make sure that everything in view is always white, because it's going to be using this one on the alpha. So Shift A, S, we'll do another mix node, and we'll change this one to colour as well. We'll drop this between the alpha here, make sure it's set to add rather than mix, factor of 1, and then we'll plug the alpha down here into the bottom, so it adds those together. And now we should be getting a perfect result. This one will show outside of the camera, and this one will show inside the camera view to ensure we get the highest quality video footage, and also anything that's moving in the video will also be moving in the reflections as well. The only thing left to do now is check the render and see if there's anything that's not looking quite right. So let's change this from an image editor to a timeline. We'll come bring the robot forward a bit, and we'll have a look at the lighting. And if this bothers you, by the way, outside of the camera being rendered, you can choose the camera. So just type cam to find it, select that, and then in the camera settings, under the viewport display, we'll turn off seperate, I think it's pronounced, so that only the portions inside of the camera are visible in the viewport. Right, so let's go full screen, and we'll have a quick look. So we can get rid of this now, and then we'll turn off the overlays. Alright, so obviously it's looking better, we're getting more of an interaction with the environment, with the PNG background, but, just zoom out a bit, the walls are much darker than the floor. So what we need to do is separate the walls from the floor so that we can tweak this separately to the floor, which we've already made sure it's the right sort of colour. So we're going to go into edit mode, just solid view. So select the pavement into edit mode, make sure we've got overlays turned on. And I'm going to alt click in face mode up here, one of these top edges, and this will set the entire loop all the way around. And then we'll do Control plus to extend that all the way down to the bottom. And then we'll do P and separate by selection. If we come back out of here, you'll see now we've got two objects. We've got the ground, or the pavement rather, and then we've got the wall. So I'll rename this one to wall. And we'll come into the material shader now. And we'll make this an emissive shader instead of a principal BSDF. Because the emissive shader will make sure that it matches perfectly with the PNG background, because it won't be being lit by the HDRI. So we're not going to get these dark areas over here where it's probably been lit from behind slightly. So make sure we duplicate this material by clicking the number 2 here. And I'll rename this to crude wall. I'm just going to replace this principal BS with an emission shader. So Shift A, S, emission. And we'll plug this into the emission colour and this one into the mix shader, and then we can get rid of the principal BSDF, so delete that one. Alright, now we don't need this here because the emission shader won't be lit by the sky, so there's no need to darken it down because it's been lit twice basically. You can delete that, Control X to delete it and automatically reconnect either side. And now if we go into rendered view in the camera, we can see it matches perfectly now with the actual PNG background. The floor is a little bit darker here, but I'm not too worried about that because we're going to turn the shadow catcher back on now anyway. So let's turn back on the shadow catcher. So with the pavement selected, we'll come into the object properties and just turn on under visibility shadow catcher. And you'll still see we're getting shadows now, and that's because the walls are casting shadow. So we'll now select the wall one, and we'll turn off shadows, and we'll also turn off diffuse, and now you can see that fixes that. Now, another alternative, if you don't want to turn these off, is to leave these turned on, but make the wall a shadow catcher as well. And a shadow catcher can't cast shadows onto a shadow catcher, basically. So that does the same thing, but allows you to keep the diffuse and shadow turned on, so that it will affect the other 3D objects. Now, we don't want the walls to be rendered, because when Blender's rendering the shadow catcher, obviously it needs to render all the pixels to check if there's any shadows there. Now, we don't need to do that with the walls, because we're not going to be casting shadows onto them. So we can actually turn off the ray visibility for the camera, and now those won't be rendered during Cycle's rendering, but they will still affect the robot. And let's just check if turning on and off the diffuse ray visibility on the walls affect the robot in any way. So still with the wall selected, let's try turning off diffuse. I just want to check whether anything happens differently on the robot. So I'll just use Ctrl B to make a small render region so we can zoom in and have a better look without rendering too many pixels. So you see it does get a little bit brighter here when we disable diffuse, because basically that wall is casting its colour onto the robot. And this is a dark sort of green tree just in this area over here. So you might want to leave it on, or you might want to turn it off. It depends on the scene, and but I'm going to leave it turned on for now. Ctrl-Alt-B. And then I think lastly, what we need to do is just make sure that the robot is actually on the floor, because I'm looking at this and I can see it seems to be levitating slightly above the ground. So let me do a few steps to see if that foot stays on the floor or doesn't go through it. So that one seems alright. Let's just check this one. Yeah, so that's looking good. If the toe was to go underneath the floor, then you could use a floor constraint on the IK foot bones so they can't go through the floor, and then you set the floor to be the pavement. Or alternatively, you could just create a new track in the NLA editor just to correct the bones where they need to be corrected. Or if both feet are consistently, away or through the floor to the same amount, then you can just move the armature up or down to correct it for the entire animation. So with all that done, the robot's fully integrated with the scene in terms of getting reflections and indirect lighting from the actual video footage. We can move on to the rendering, and then we'll do some compositing where we can actually push the realism to the next level, matching things in the video such as motion blur, noise. We'll do some automatic masking, and quite a bit to come. So I'll see you in the next one.